the American cinematographer about a lens that NASA used and was made by Zeiss. He was incredibly excited. His very, very fast lens allowed him to actually do this, to light a set with candlelight.
That was revolutionary, I think, definitely. But that was typical Stanley, of getting those lenses, getting Ed DiGiulio to put them on a BNC camera. That's the sort of thing that Stanley was very, very clever at.
Costumes were a big topic, because what Stanley didn't want is this kind of stiff costume look of newly made costumes. He was very impressed by the immigrants and the new land. And he thought, this is amazing how the costumes look like it's the real thing. It's not, new. So he, in fact, called Jan Troell. He said, this is Stanley Kubrick. Jan Troell hung up. He thought it was a prank. Well, he finally got him on the line and said, don't hang up. He asked him, who did the costumes? And he said, oh, this was done by Ella Britt Söderlund. How did she do it? Well, she aged the material, she dyed the material, so it had this real flow and looked like used clothes, which is so essential. So we hired Ulla Britt Söderlund, and she did that job, working actually for our costume designer, which was Milena Canonero.
The costumes were all copied from paintings. None of the costumes were, quote, designed. I think this has become the only sensible way to do historical costumes. It's stupid to have, a designer interpret the 18th century.
The costume detail was incredible. Beautiful materials, hand-dyed silks, hand-embroidered buttons. You would see Milena sitting there hand-embroidering buttons for the costumes.
Milena not only made and designed, she also looked for costumes in museums and to borrow them. Some of the costumes in Barry Lyndon are period, are originals. They were not copies. They were actually 18th century waistcoats. The military uniforms were also a mixture. Some were copies, some were originals.
Stanley wanted to make sure that the aristocrats, i.e. Maurice and Berenson, looked right. All the aristocrats, especially at that time in England, the families were always pure white. The servants inside were white. Why there was a special white makeup that Anne Brodie had designed.
And it became quite clear. I mean, very soon you just cannot limit yourself to Hertfordshire. It's just not possible.
Originally, the film was going to be entirely shot in the UK. Suddenly, a decision is made, quite last minute as well, to move the production entirely across to Ireland.
The key part was it had to look right for the late 18th century, and you cannot fake that.
Ken Adam was a production designer on the movie, and he had originally wanted to build sets. But he and Stanley decided on locations, and Stanley wanted the patina and the atmosphere that real old houses can provide. I was this, 19-year-old without a specific job to do, and I had already been taught how to take photographs by Stanley, so he said, right, you can go and start looking for locations. I started in Ireland because that's where they started filming, and so myself and a team of 4 or 5 other photographers were sent across the Irish countryside photographing locations and stately homes. The guidelines that we had were paintings of the period so that we could see what the interiors of houses were like, and of course the countryside. And the special instructions were, we don't want to see any signs of modern life. But he always wanted to see 360. So each roll of film was slated, what house it was, and the map coordinates, and what time of day it was, and very specific information.
The pre-production phase will have taken at least 15 months. So we're talking a year and 3 months, maybe even a year and a half before the cameras roll.
What happens, of course, with Stanley is we would sit down before a movie and lay out how long we think it's going to take, Now, then you'd think, well, got to take twice as long. That's a certainty. Can't take less. We didn't really have all the locations in place as we would have had because we hadn't been to Dublin to look at the locations there. None of that had been settled apart from going to Dublin Castle, which is an obvious place to shoot. And also the screenplay not being written, basically. Script that thick with one scene in one page with just a description of the scene and no dialogue in loads of it. I mean, that was when we started shooting. I mean, that was all really in trouble. The Waterford was a wonderful place.
Ryan had really kind of got himself into the real character, like a lot of actors today. He didn't want to be called Ryan or Mr. O'Neill. He wanted to be called Lord Lyndon or Barry Lyndon.
Marissa Berenson, we saw her in Cabaret, and we thought she was just brilliant. Yeah, and she looks great, and she's a fantastic figure. And so that was the two principles.
The casting process, it was on videotape. It was the first time I'd ever seen that or come across it. But in actual fact, for me, I thought, this is great, because I'm not trying to impress a person in the room. I mean, Stanley was never there for audition. It left me feeling much freer.
I remember flying to Ireland for a costume fitting and also to meet Stanley for the first time. And I just remember it was very quick, but it made a massive impression because he was like smiling and very warm, and I automatically felt very comfortable, and he did make you feel interesting and wanted and special. And that was my first impression of Stanley.
The very first time when I got to set or where they were shooting, and I said, well, can I have a script? Because it hadn't been sent out. And they gave me a script. And on the first page, it said, Barry fights a duel with, scene to be written. And page 2 is scene 2, scene to be written. And I sort of went through this whole script, and every scene was to be written. And I thought, well, what's going, weird. But as it went on and the film sort of developed, that he was able to work out through this sort of exploratory process that he had, and also gave him a lot of thought so that the film could radically be very different from whatever script you had in your hand in the first place.
The text usually has to be changed in some way or another. New ideas occur, old ideas are dropped, and then they have to assimilate all this. The strain really is making the thing happen in the rehearsal and getting the scene to the point where you know that it's doing what it should do.
What was radically different about it was that it was closer to a theatrical experience. Because Stanley rehearsed so much, it was to let you find the character, or get something inside the character that was going to make a difference. It's a little bit of, exaggeration to always talk about, the endless takes. I mean, we did do sometimes endless takes. You see, so much of it was a rehearsal, and so much of it was over and over again to sort of get the feeling right, the temperature. He never knew how he was going to shoot a scene when we walked on set. But that kind of working meant that he could find a first angle, first shot. And out of that first shot, everything else would grow. And so by the time you got to actually perform the scene, when the camera was running, somehow the whole pretense of acting had fallen away. It became a natural part of you. It meant, in England during that time, the way you appeared actually showed your wealth. So, for instance, the lace cuffs, which were very, very expensive, you had to display it. And then the actual clothes that you wore weren't really physically friendly. They made you into a pose. It was about showing, ostentatiousness in your lifestyles, and that immediately sort of make a difference to whoever was beneath you. And they always thought about it as being beneath them.
Lord Patrick Plunkett was the Queen's equerry. He got special permission from the Queen to come and be with our technical advisor when we were in England on film, saying that's how the aristocrats, that's how they hold a knife.
Lord Patrick Plunkett, who was an old friend of mine, I put him onto Stanley. He was delighted to help us, and we got most of our big house permissions from Patrick. He, in fact, played a part in the film. He was the person who introduced Barry Lyndon to court at Goodwood House.
Keep to a constant speed that Stanley needed for consistency.
And so we have to have the guys pulling it. We spent the whole day running, pulling that bloody carriage, about 12 of us, until everyone was completely knackered. And then we get 12 more in there. Oh, it was horrendous. That was a Stanley special for us.
If Stanley came onto a set and he still wasn't 100% happy with it, it doesn't matter how many people we would have there or how many actors, he would decide there and then we'll do it another day. When Stanley was making a film, you've got to be prepared you could be involved for 1 year, whether you're me or whether you're one of the actors, because he takes his time.
It is an endurance test with Stanley, but it's exactly the same as being with David Lean. You find with these directors who make films only occasionally, once they have all their old mates around them, they tend to keep them there for a long time, and you can't particularly get away.
Thank God I'd worked on all those difficult movies before Stanley Kubrick. Otherwise, I don't think I would have lasted.
But Stanley always had questions for you about everything, every day, you know, a huge list of things you should be doing or supposed to have been doing.
Always write everything down. You're not a computer. Write everything down. And he would say, now, Michael, 2 weeks ago on the 4th of May, Monday at 11 a.m. on the set, I asked you, when would I be able to see Marisa, Lady Lyndon, funeral wig? When was it ready for me to see? You haven't come back to me, and that was 2 weeks ago. What happened?
You had to sort of really do all sorts of different things that would be most unusual. It made life a piece of cake when you didn't really know what he was getting into. Dougie Milsom and myself, we went off and did it all, and it worked very well.
You can't film everything in Ireland or in England if the story takes you to Germany. You have to also, for the audience, you have to show we are now at a different place. So we hired Jan Schluber, who is a well-established and well-connected German art director. And then he goes and photographs the places. We give it back to Stanley, and he decides which of the suggested locations he really likes.
We went with the second unit, just a few of us, to Germany, where a lot of the castles and rumbais and things like that we shot there, and Potsdam.
The most interesting one was Potsdam. These were the administrative buildings of Frederick the Great. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. After some exchanges, they invited me to go to East Berlin. The script of Barry Lyndon was confiscated at the border, but once the formalities were taken care of with the political side, it went like a dream. It was fantastic. They took all the communist propaganda flags off the buildings, removed the telephone box, put gravel on the street, got the horses from the stable, including the period gear that the horses wear, and a coach or two from the museums. I mean, they were extremely helpful once the first hurdle of making sure that Barry Lyndon was not an anti-communist propaganda film had been resolved.
Daddy wanted to send a second unit to Castle Howard. So I went up there, and my instructions were get the master shot. So I photographed the whole area with the lake and the house in the background and composed it nicely so that he could give an 8x10 to the second unit photographer, so shoot it from this angle. So that was quite a huge responsibility, really. I did lots of little things. Second unit, writing Lady Lyndon.
He suddenly realized, I know. He said, you're going to vomit. So I thought, well, I can't vomit on Will. So he said, okay, well, we'll plan it. So we're going to shoot it after lunch. And for lunch, I was given this cocktail of cold soup, sort of chicken and tomato all mashed up together. The chicken was cooked, I'll give them that. And, sort of ullard, salady stuff. It was just absolutely, you could have modeled a house out of it. It was so gooey and gummy and disgusting. And we got into position and, it was, okay, action. And it was like, oh, I feel all right now. What am I going to do? I couldn't be sick. And he said to the props, bring him the raw egg. They got an egg from the caterer's truck. and they cracked it open, they put it in this cup, and he said, okay, when I say action, you swallow that raw egg, okay, and then you run to that wall to vomit. And I said, oh, okay. All right, so he said action, I drank it, and it was like...
The brothers are already estimating that the film is going to cost $3 million more than they had initially budgeted for, and eventually the film cost around about $11 million in total.
Stanley was very budget-minded, absolutely. He didn't like the idea at all of going over budget. But in the very end, he had to be satisfied with what he delivered.
Kubrick had different ideas about how he wanted to do the soundtrack and the music. There's a list where he's specifying specific tracks that he's interested in. Sarabande is already on there, Fantasia is on there, but also he's listing film composers. Rota is on there. Morricone is contemplated. He doesn't seem to have decided until late August 1975 that he's actually going to use all pre-recorded existing classical music.
Kubrick was a very musical man himself and had a broad knowledge of music. In Barry Lyndon, it was different. I mean, the choices are enormous. You have the whole repertoire of 18th century music. So on Barry Lyndon, I did a lot of research. I was very involved with the score, suggesting music. I was not involved in making the decision. I can't underline this strongly enough, but I loved it. It was a side job of me, and I was feeding him music. And then he said, oh, yes, I like this. Get me more of those. Very concerned how his film would arrive with the audience. He was totally entrusted with this project. Nobody interfered. Warner Brothers totally left him alone. He wanted to deserve this freedom. And he was very, very sad if a film didn't bring Warner Brothers their money back. In case of Barry Lyndon, this was a problem because Barry Lyndon was expensive and was badly received in the United States and Canada, in the English-speaking world, basically.
Stanley was really emotionally hurt. He said to me, he said, what do people want from a movie? I mean, he just didn't understand it, you know, because a lot of it was kind of thoughtless criticism. But it's a radically different feeling about the film now.
It was really the first movie that I had worked on as an adult. So I thought all movies were made that way. So when I went on to have a, film career of my own and work for other directors, I thought they were being really sloppy.
Yeah, he was different to any other director I'd worked with before, and he's different to any other director that I've worked with since.
I think he was the premier filmmaker of the 20th century. I mean, he spanned it beautifully. 1928, he was born. 1999, he died.
There'll never be another Stanley Kubrick. His legacy will live forever, I think.
You see, the proof is that all his films remain. And what is a great work of art? A great work of art, whether it's a novel or a painting or a composition or a sculpture or a film, is that it doesn't disappear. Well, and